back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again is my good friend Benjamin Norton. Ben is based in Nicaragua, and he recently wrote a great piece for his website, which you should be reading regularly, multipolarista.com. This piece was entitled, let me get it exactly right, Polls Show Almost No One Trusts U.S. Media After Decades of War, Propaganda, and Lies. And he does a great job of, well, we'll talk about it. But first of all, Ben Norton, thanks for coming back on the program.
It's always a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Well, as I said, as I started to say in my introduction, and I thought, well, I'll just say it to you, you did a great job here of pulling together a kind of exhaustive inventory of the lies that the U.S. media has purveyed upon the American people and people worldwide, and what it's brought the media to in terms of public trust. Today, just 11% of North Americans trust television news. That was based on a Gallup poll, right?
Yeah, it was from Gallup.
And it says 11% of North Americans trust television news, and a mere 16% have confidence in newspapers. I don't know whether to be surprised those numbers are so low or surprised they're so high. But I guess they represent a complete collapse in what used to be reasonably trusted institutions. You show Gallup's long-term numbers. It's weird that they didn't start polling trust in television news till the early 90s. That seems late, but they were polling trust in newspapers as far back as 1972, when there was 39% trust, rose to 51% in around 1980. I wonder why that was. I'm trying to figure out what might have spiked the trust. And I'm sure back in the late 1960s, early 70s, television news was extremely trusted. That was the Walter Cronkite era. But since then, it's been all downhill from there. Any thoughts before we go into what's happened since then on the era, I guess we could call it the golden era of trust in American media?
Well, I think one of the things that this poll shows is that even that myth of the golden era of trust in the media is a bit hyperbolic. We see, according to this Gallup poll, that at the highest point they have recorded in the history of polling, in around 1979, 1980, the peak point was only 51% of people in the U.S. trusted newspapers. So that's roughly half. That's the peak point. So even that golden era was actually, not as golden as we're told it was. And as for what might explain the growth of trust in the 70s, maybe it could be the role of the media in, Watergate, and
right,
the Church Committee, and this impression that the media was playing its role. Bernstein was, they were playing their role as these whistleblowers exposing the crimes of the intelligence community. Maybe that could be part of it, but what is undeniable is that since then, if you just look at the graph, there's been a consistent decline, just consistently since the 1980s. And that brings us to today, where only 11% of people in the US believe TV media and 16% newspapers. And of course, I explained one of the reasons I think that is in this article, which is people have been lied to so consistently for so many decades, and those lies have become more brazen, harder to hide. And of course, another factor which is significant is the brazen partisanship of media. Whereas you talk about this golden age of the media, and this is during the time of the fairness doctrine, right, which no longer exists. And media was not allowed to be explicitly partisan in terms of Democratic and Republican lines, at least mainstream TV media. And now, ever since the end of the fairness doctrine and deregulation, we see that all the major TV networks blatantly follow the political line of one of the two parties.
That is multiple great points, including, of course, Watergate had something to do with this spike in respect. But even at the peak of that spike, nearly half the public, certainly within margin of error, so we could say half the public did not trust newspapers. So we have never really trusted the American media. And I would venture to say that those who did in those days might be thought of as the liberal establishment more than anybody else. But then we see that that there was lower trust after that, declining and then declining sharply from the late 90s onward. From there, you go into the pattern of lies, starting with Frank Wisner. Who was Frank Wisner?
This is one of the co-founders of the CIA, a very important CIA officer. And he rather infamously boasted that the CIA had so many assets in the media that they could play the media like what he called a mighty Wurlitzer. And people might know that a Wurlitzer was a company that made musical instruments, and a Wurlitzer was a kind of musical instrument. They don't really exist anymore. But in that time period in the 1950s, when he was speaking, they were pretty popular. So essentially what he was saying is that the CIA could play the press as a musical instrument. And if you look at his quote, he's not only talking about the US media, actually. I mean, of course, my article is about the US media because it's about trust in the US media or the lack thereof. But if you look at Wisner's quote, he also boasted that the CIA had assets around the world in different media outlets. And he also explained one of the tactics that the CIA would use is that they would use this very obscure newspaper in a foreign country, and then the CIA would plant a fake story in that small newspaper, and then another more mainstream newspaper, perhaps in the West or in Korea or Japan, would cite that smaller newspaper, and then you would have a more established newspaper like the New York Times would cite, say, the South Korean newspaper. And then you have this idea that there's some kind of legitimacy, but if you actually follow the chain of evidence, it's based very loosely on this very unreliable source. And this is, today we can see this clearly with a lot of the way that Radio Free Asia works, RFA, which was created by the CIA. And they spread a lot of very hyperbolic, ridiculous claims, and they often originate with like some anonymous defector from North Korea or anonymous Chinese dissident or something. And this anonymous claim is amplified, and then RFA, Radio Free Asia, will turn into a story, and then other Western media outlets will cite Radio Free Asia, which gives it an air of legitimacy. And this is exactly how the CIA has used disinformation going back many decades, targeting the Soviet Union, targeting China, North Korea. And the New York Times actually has an article that admits all of this. And it's something to the effect of how the CIA created a global propaganda machine. And so the fact is that this is pretty well documented now, but of course they were talking about the first Cold War. And when that ended in 1991, some of this information came out, so we can kind of understand how it works today.
And by the way, the Wurlitzer did make different kinds of instruments, but what Frank Wisner was referring to is they used to make a giant organ with all sorts of not only keys but buttons and all sorts of different pedals. So it was really gigantic. So what he was really saying was that that they had a media instrument that had so many different parts to it that they could, plant a story in Asia and a related story in Africa and a related story somewhere else, and kind of create a whole, orchestrated narrative out of it. So he was really saying they had a very, as I interpreted what you just said, he was really saying they had a very sophisticated operation to drive the narrative, and presumably at times with the willing complicity of major American newspapers.
Yeah, the New York Times article that I mentioned, it's actually from 1977, which once again I think might explain why in the late 70s there was this peak of confidence in the media at this time of church committee and investigations into the spy agencies. So the New York Times published this article in 77 titled "Worldwide Propaganda Network Built by the CIA," and it actually quotes Frank Wisner, the CIA officer who talked about the mighty Wurlitzer or Wisner's Wurlitzer. And the CIA had what it referred to as its propaganda assets inventory. Now, of course, in this New York Times article, they claim that a lot of that infrastructure was dismantled. And of course, I think we can all be very skeptical of that claim. But I think that also explains once again why there was this brief moment of support and confidence in the media, although again it peaked at 51%, because they started to expose some of those lies and propaganda techniques.
You also quote Malcolm X, recognizing the power of the U.S. media, like others at the time, but not very many of them, right? I mean, there were a few voices as early as the 1960s recognizing that the media was driving the narrative.
Yeah, and I should explain that one of the reasons I wrote this article is actually more for a Latin American audience. I was asked to give a lecture to students and like media activists in Nicaragua, and so I wrote this article, and obviously it's in English too, but there was a Spanish translation. So I mean, I'm glad that you liked it, but I did try to keep it very general for people who don't know a lot about the U.S. media, and especially that Malcolm X quote. I mean, a lot of people have probably heard it before, but Malcolm X famously said that the media is the most powerful tool because it can convince the oppressed that they're the oppressors and the oppressors that they're the oppressed. And we can see that so clearly today with war propaganda. And that's why I went through that history just briefly, Gulf of Tonkin, the 2 Iraq wars, the different lies about Russiagate, the different lies about Syria. I mean, it's helpful to have all those lies documented in the same place.
Sure, absolutely. And I would say, even if you wrote it for a Latin American audience, there are certain elements in here that maybe a lot of progressive or left people, I wouldn't necessarily say progressive, but a lot of left people in this country would know, but many wouldn't. For example, the media's history of lying in defense of U.S. wars being traceable back to the beginning of the country. Yeah, I think people might know that. Some might not. The fact that a newspaper would describe indigenous people in this country as barbarians and uncivilized, that might surprise some people here. I think most people here know about yellow journalism, but I would say that probably some people would be surprised at some of the coverage you describe of the nuclear bombs that the United States dropped on Japan. We think we know now, and that we must have always known what was done there, but really the reporting on it at the time was extremely misleading, wasn't it?
Yeah. First of all, there still today are many myths and frankly lies about the nuclear bombings of Japan that we see in the media. I mean, every single year in the anniversary around this time in August, we see articles defending the bombing. There are sometimes articles saying that it wasn't necessary. I mean, the U.S. Department of War, that's what it was called at the time, did a strategic bombing survey. This is from the mouth of the U.S. government and what became the Air Force. And they acknowledged that the bombing was not necessary, that Japan would have surrendered. And many historians point out that the bombing of Japan, the nuclear bombings, were really the first act of the Cold War. It was to prevent the Soviet Union from making Japan into a socialist government and making Japan into an ally. And that's the reason. I mean, the US knew that Japan was going to surrender, and they wanted Japan to surrender right when the Soviet Union was invading, because the Soviet Union didn't invade right until the end, especially when they were going into Mongolia and Manchuria. So that lie is still something that we see very very often that the media claims that the bombings were necessary. But even aside from that, I mean, another more egregious lie is something that I document in this article is back in a few weeks after the bombing, which was, of course, August 1945, in the weeks after, there were many articles in the mainstream press downplaying the severity of the bombing, downplaying the number of people who were killed. We now know that there was between 100 and 200,000 civilians who were killed in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in September, a few weeks after the bombings, the New York Times published an article quoting U.S. military leadership, insisting that there was no fallout. There was no radioactivity. The New York Times article is titled, "No Radioactivity in Hiroshima Ruin." So this is yet another example of this very well-established history that we still see today of the media simply echoing the claims of U.S. government officials and treating them as if they're simply facts. We see this so often with the New York Times and the Washington Post. They get fed a lot of these stories from intelligence agencies, from the Pentagon, and then they'll just quote the Pentagon and they'll quote what they say. They'll repeat it as if it's a fact because the Pentagon said it. And here we see another very inglorious example of the Pentagon saying something that we now know is blatantly false, that yes, there was radioactive fallout after the bombing, but this is not something new.
As a sort of personal aside, my mother was with the USO, the sort of theater and entertainment arm of the armed forces in occupied Japan right after the defeat, and was taken by, I guess, a boyfriend to see Nagasaki just very, very shortly after the bombing. And it really changed her views, made her anti-war for the rest of her life. But later she developed cancer. We often wondered, because of the nature of the cancer, whether it was related to that visit or not. It was possible, we were told, but there's never any way to know. But obviously, I think at that point, even the soldiers themselves were not warned of the radioactivity in the ruins, so they would go and look at it in their off hours.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much propaganda about Chernobyl. There's been these documentaries recently, very slickly, highly produced documentaries, and even like fiction series based on it. But there's much less, discussion of the horrible fallout, not only for, U.S. soldiers and people visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but for Japanese people. And, Japan is supposedly a U.S. ally. It's still occupied by the U.S. There's still 55,000 U.S. troops, and so little discussion of the impact on the Japanese people. And, there's been large protests in Japan for a long time against the U.S. military presence, especially in Okinawa, which is colonized by Japan. Okinawa was an independent, it had its own indigenous culture, and it was colonized by the Japanese Empire and then was just given to Japan after the end of World War II. There's so little discussion of the impact on the Japanese people, which once again, I think reflects a lot of that propaganda in the media.
Yeah, for sure. And as you say, we're still hearing stories. I would say, Ben, to me, it seems worse now than it was even in 1945. At least I went and read the no radioactivity in Hiroshima ruin story, and at least they attribute it in quotes to the general there. Now they'll report it without even an attribution, just as fact. One example that comes to mind was the story that Russia was paying bounties to, I forget if it's Taliban or Al-Qaeda, for killing American soldiers, which struck me, among other things, no matter how much you want to inflict harm on Americans, that would be an extremely inefficient way to do it, among other things. But they would report this with no attribution, just as fact in the New York Times and elsewhere. It seemed to me just bad journalistic practice. You need to attribute, you need to say where so it seems to me, if anything, this propagandistic repeating of what you're told has only gotten worse. It's now presented as first person reporting, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, this story was sometimes referred to as Bounty Gate, and it's a clear example of the U.S. intelligence agency, specifically the CIA, playing the media as that instrument we were talking about, as the mighty Wurlitzer, because the goal was to prevent Trump from withdrawing from Afghanistan. And obviously, this isn't to praise Trump in any way, but Trump he at least said he was trying to withdraw from Afghanistan. And then what happened is the CIA began leaking this intelligence that was only attributed to anonymous officials. And the Washington Post took the lead on this, and then the New York Times followed. And they published story after story over several weeks. And this led to the House. There was a House committee that was led in this vote by Liz Cheney that voted to block Trump from withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. And of course, Biden later did it. And the irony is that Biden actually probably, I'm certainly not one to praise Biden. He's done so many horrible things, but it's probably one of the better things that Biden has done. And it actually probably hurt his approval rating, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because it was done so poorly. The irony is if Trump had done it, it probably would have hurt Trump's approval rating and probably would have helped the Democrats. But the national security state was so dedicated to trying to prevent this withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a very clear CIA operation to spread this fake story claiming that Russia was paying the Taliban to kill U.S. troops, as if the Taliban needed motivation after 20 years of being militarily occupied by the U.S. and NATO. But anyway, this story happened in 2020. It had its intended impact of preventing the withdrawal. And then just a few months later, there were mainstream articles in like the Daily Beast and NBC News acknowledging that was not true, that there was actual no evidence that Russia was paying these bounties to the Taliban. But of course, it had its intended impact, so it didn't really matter. And another point to mention about this is that another, I think, qualitative difference between reporting in the past few decades and in the 70s and 80s, I've gone back and read a lot of that reporting, especially I've done a lot of research on, Iran-Contra. And if you go back and read a lot of that reporting, it's not to say necessarily that it's much better, but one qualitative difference is that there was very little quotation of anonymous officials back in the 70s and 80s. And I don't know exactly when that began. I think it probably began around like the time of the War on Terror after 9/11. But this practice of quoting anonymous officials and making entire stories built around anonymous officials is something pretty new in journalism. It's very irresponsible, but it's yet another example of how these media outlets get fed these stories from spy agencies, and there's no accountability for the spy agencies in general, but especially because the people quoted are anonymous.
And it used to be, in fact, I still think the Professional Journalist Society has rules around anonymous sources, and they're never followed. That, people do it. You only quote a source anonymously if they fear for their personal safety or their professional livelihood or what have you, and so on. And if they ever lie to you, you're entitled to out them. You don't quote them again, and so on. None of these things are ever followed. But the other thing that concerns me, what I was alluding to, especially with the bounty story, but others as well, many others, the Havana Syndrome story, which has since been discredited, for example, is that they're often reported not as anonymous official says XYZ is happening, but reported and re-reported as unquestioned fact that, the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or the Washington Post will say this is occurring. And not official X says this is occurring, but this is occurring. And then there may be, and that's a front page story, then there may be something on 832 that eventually says, official says, there's no evidence. You get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a very significant development that we've seen in really the past decade or two. And I think a lot of this is also related to the complete deterioration of media standards and during the War on Terror and the beginning of embedded journalism. And just we see that the media just became so slavishly just following the lines, the propaganda line of the CIA and the Pentagon on WMDs and then the war in Syria, the war in Libya. But in terms of this, just stating the unsubstantiated claims of anonymous officials as fact, you see this in headlines too. And polls also show, studies show that the majority of people in the US who consume media only read the headlines, and then of the vast majority only read the headlines and then the first few paragraphs. I think there's something like 10% of people in the US who regularly read media who actually read the full article. So we can't overstate how important it is to look at headlines and the way they're presented, and then leads and stories. And frequently, what we've seen in the past few decades is that media outlets will, until recently, what they would do is they would, so let's say, for instance, Russiagate. We have an anonymous official in the US government claim something without evidence. So maybe 10, 20 years ago, the headline might have been, Trump colluded with Russia in election, comma, officials say, comma, CIA says. And then, right. I don't know exactly when this started, maybe like a decade ago, they started cutting officials said and would start putting it in quotes, right? They would put quotes and say, Trump, quote, colluded with Russia, end quote, for election. And then it's like, okay, well, that's a quote attributed to someone, okay? And then you read the article and you say, well, it's attributed to anonymous officials. And then sometime several years ago, they just started dropping the quotes. Right. They don't even use the quotes anymore. And they just say Trump colluded with Russia in election. So it's definitely an example, I think, of a major deterioration that we've seen just in the past few years. I'm in my 30s, I'm not very old. And just being a journalist for the past 10 years, I've seen a very marked shift in media standards. I think part of this is also related to the social mediaization of news reportings, and the Washington Post has really taken the lead. The New York Times has been much more reticent to become much more social media friendly, but the Washington Post, especially the fact that it was bought by Jeff Bezos, has really dropped a lot of its standards and become much more similar to like BuzzFeed and its very social media oriented journalism.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And again, we're talking with Benjamin Norton of Multipolarista. And I just have to inject that I wasn't working in journalism at the time that the first Gulf War happened, but I remember that it was the second Gulf War actually, where all of a sudden, there's this infatuation that the entire mainstream journalism profession has now with the military and the intelligence world. And I remember all of a sudden on cable TV, everybody was talking about CENTCOM says this, CENTCOM says that. We're here at CENTCOM, like overnight, and without explaining. And I was like, what the F is CENTCOM? And they were just so infatuated with the buzzword, right? And it's like Central Command Headquarters in Kuwait or wherever, Abu Dhabi, for the entire operation. But it's like you were on the inside, you knew the buzzword. And so this is, in the first Gulf War, it was Ted Koppel in his overcoat, Burberry overcoat, landing in this capital or that capital. It's this sort of, just this identification with the military-industrial complex, the adoption of the buzzwords of NatSec or whomever, that to me, it's also a big part of this. They love that world. They want to be a part of that world. It's glamorous to them. It's not a killing machine. Or something that undermines democracy. It's not something that would crush them in a heartbeat if it became useful to do so. They don't remember the killing of journalists at the outset of the Second Gulf War or anything like that. To them, it's cool. Fair?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a cultural element in a lot of this that shouldn't necessarily be understated, although it shouldn't be overstated, in that in the US media, and in general, I think in media corps around the world, press corps, there is this kind of cultural affinity, and especially this striverism that is very common because the media is so competitive. It's really a dog-eat-dog industry. And so many people are trying to get the next scoop and trying to get more bylines and publish in bigger publications.
Right.
And when you get those kinds of sources in intelligence agencies, in the military, you do feel like you have a little more power. And I mean, I've never worked at like a super mainstream outlet. I did work for a few years in a somewhat mainstream newsroom at Salon. And because Salon is kind of mainstream, I was able to like do interviews with presidential candidates and get access to, political events and, the DNC and the RNC. So I had a little, I have a little insight into that world. And a lot of those people, especially at the Washington Post and New York Times, they see themselves very highly. They think that they're, playing an important political role in the U.S. political system. And I think another thing about the U.S. political system is because it's so undemocratic and so dominated by these two corporate parties. And in order to become involved in the political system, you have to have so much money. Another poll that I show in this article is that, because I argue that the lack of confidence in the media is also just a symptom of the lack of confidence in institutions in general in the United States. And Congress has a 7% approval rating. And if you look at studies of of money and the influence of money in congressional races, people running for the House, over 90% of the time, the candidate with more money wins the race, right? So because the political system is just so undemocratic and the bar of entry is so high, a lot of people actually enter the media in order to be involved in politics. And when you are at the Washington Post and New York Times, you actually are in many ways, you are playing the role of like a politician. You have a lot of power. And we see this, with people like Jake Tapper and others who they play a role kind of like a politician. Certainly, at Fox News, certainly the Fox News pundits play a role very influential in the political system. We actually saw a lot of reports that, and I've heard from, people in Washington that Trump really wanted Tucker Carlson to be his vice presidential candidate. And, and certainly at MSNBC, we see the same thing. Now, the former press secretary for the Biden White House, Jen Psaki, is now an MSNBC pundit. So we can't overstate understate. Well, again, we shouldn't overstate, but we can't understate the cultural element in that a lot of these people in the mainstream press corps, they want to be part of that system, and maybe they couldn't have been part of it because of whatever other reasons, but this is as close as they can get. So they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, not only because they're feeding them stories, but also because they see them kind of as peers and colleagues.
Sometimes that means being astonishingly credulous, though, when it comes to stories that even the most minimal investigation would, you would just have to doubt them just on the face. I mean, you reminded me of something, Ben, that I had long forgotten, which was the story of Naira in the run-up to the first Gulf War, that a young woman was brought before Congress, identified only by her first name, telling terrible stories of Iraqi soldiers removing Kuwaiti babies from incubators, leaving them on the ground to die, and so on. This Naira turned out to be the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador. Kuwait, of course, being the country that Iraq had invaded over an oil dispute. So, it seems to me that a story like that, that's so extreme, you might want to ask around about it if you're a journalist. I mean, maybe, but the fact that journalists repeat stories despite, being misled so many times and without even minimal investigation, when they're presented in a certain way by certain people, just seems to me to be part of this culture of coziness with the political establishment you're describing.
Absolutely. In the case of Naira, this is a classic example of this kind of atrocity journalism where you take the unsubstantiated claims of some kind of dissident and then just amplify them and portray them as if they're true. I mean, something I didn't talk about in the article because it would have been an endless black hole of fake news is the reporting on North Korea, right? I mean, there's so many fake stories that are all attributed to like some anonymous dissident defector. And by the way, like North Korean defectors are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to defect to the South. And then the stories completely fall apart. There's this young woman who now lives in the US and she's become like a media celebrity among like right-wing podcasters and Fox News and stuff named Young-Soo Park. And she is from North Korea and defected to the South and was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars and now lives in the US and like has got all this surgery and has like a YouTube channel. And she's a very strange character. And she did this interview with, I'll think of his name in a second, the very popular podcaster who was Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
She did interviews with Joe Rogan, and she claimed that like in North Korea, there's no food, so people all eat each other. Like there's all this rampant cannibalism, which is insane. And then she said that like in North Korea, there's no electricity, so people have to push the trains, which obviously is just insanely false because if there's no electricity, they wouldn't push the train, they would just walk. Right, but anyway, right. I mean, all these fake, but the point is that there's no interrogation of this stuff because it reaffirms all these stereotypes about Iraq and North Korea and Iran and whatever. And this is something that goes back many decades. Naira, of course, ended up being the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, but that wasn't revealed. And she spoke on the floor of the US Congress, of the House, and testified and spoke about all these fake stories. And then, of course, that was reported on by the media as, fact. We see this again and again in the war in Libya, for instance. There were these false claims that Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader, was giving his soldiers Viagra and encouraging them to assault women. Completely false. Hillary Clinton spread that false claim. Later, Amnesty International admitted there was no evidence of that it was false. And then we saw in the war in Syria, I mean, again and again and again and again and again, some anonymous dissident and defector living in Turkey or in the US or wherever will just make some outlandish claim about the Syrian government and things that they supposedly did. And then that just becomes reported as fact. And then, of course, you have renowned Pulitzer Prize winning journalists like Seymour Hersh, who come out with all these stories acknowledging that a lot of these claims about Syria were false, that even U.S. intelligence agencies knew that supposed chemical attacks were probably carried out by the CIA-backed extremist Islamist forces. And then Seymour Hersh is pilloried and portrayed as this crazy conspiracy theorist, one of the greatest journalists in the history of U.S. media. And now he can't even publish, not only in U.S. media, he's now even blacklisted from a lot of European media, from what I've heard from talking with Sy Hersh, because some of the stories, he had to publish them like in the London Review of Books and then like these German newspapers, and he's been completely blacklisted. So that's another significant difference. I mean, not to romanticize the media in the 70s and 80s, it's always had a lot of problems, but these days, even Pulitzer Prize winning journalists are canceled. I mean, talk about cancel culture. You see all these like conservatives complaining about cancel culture. That's cancel culture. A Pulitzer Prize winning journalist writing really good journalism, citing U.S. intelligence officials, but what he says is inconvenient to the narrative of the empire, so he's blacklisted.
Yeah, and I guess that's the moral of the story, and that's the reason why trust has eroded. People do have an instinct for BS, and there's a lot of talk now about fake news and bemoaning the rise in fake news, and it does create, genuine problems and insanity of various kinds. And, but I always want to say to people in our line of work, maybe more mainstream branches of it, maybe journalism ought to look to its side of the street. When you lose the public's trust, that creates a vacuum that is going to be filled by somebody. And, if you're really concerned about quote unquote fake news, I guess my message to mainstream media would be then stop purveying it. That's the best thing you can do to prevent the spread of it. But anyway, that's my closing.
Like the famous Chomsky quote: "If you're so concerned about terrorism, stop participating in it."
Right. Same principle. But that's my final thought. Do you have any?
Yeah, well, I just want to briefly mention, I concluded this article because, again, it was originally, I wrote it for a Latin American audience, but obviously I think, people in the US who don't follow the media, I think they can really benefit from just studying some of these historical examples of these fake news stories that were willingly spread by the press. But at the end of the article, I concluded arguing that I think that the erosion of confidence in the media is a symptom of a larger crisis in the US, which is an institutional crisis of the lack of confidence in general in political institutions in the United States and how undemocratic they are. And you can see other studies. I have a poll from Pew that shows trust of government from the Eisenhower era and to today, and it's completely dropped. And of course, a lot of this is partisan as well. I mean, I talked about the partisan element, which we can't underestimate. How when a Democrat's in power, Republicans will not trust the government, and how when Republicans in power, Democrats won't trust the government. Certainly with Trump, that became very clear with a lot of the liberal opposition that evaporated when Biden became president. But I mean, if you look at this poll, it just shows that there was in the Eisenhower and Kennedy and even Johnson administrations a lot of confidence, around 70%. In the government, and that's completely eroded, especially in the Nixon era. Obviously, the killing of JFK certainly played a role in that, and since then, it's all been downhill. But that's not the only thing. I mean, if you look at other polls, 7% of people in the U.S. have confidence in Congress, 14% in the justice system, 14% in big business. That should be even lower. 23% in the presidency, 25% in the Supreme Court. And that was according to a poll that was done last year. I'm sure confidence in the Supreme Court has eroded even more since then. And even only 45% of people in the US trust the police, which actually, I mean, it sounds pretty high, but it's actually lower than I thought it would be, because there are so many conservatives who have tried to push this idea of what's the thin blue line or whatever.
Blue line, yeah.
And those flags they have of the police flags, like the black and white police flag with the blue line. Like there has been this concerted, Fox News propaganda campaign to try to romanticize and heroize the police, but only 45% of people in the U.S. trust the police. And ironically, one of the only institutions in the U.S. that does have confidence is the military, which is pretty scary. It's one of the only institutions that has confidence over 50%. So I think we should analyze the lies in the media and the propaganda tactics and why we've gotten to this point. But I think it also this discussion should be situated in a larger context, in that the U.S. is a deeply undemocratic, authoritarian society where people do not trust their political institutions. And that's I think, a factor in the violence in the U.S. Not to make it like a cultural thing. I think there are material reasons, right? But the U.S. is a deeply nihilistic society. And that's one of the reasons there are these young people who maybe in Japan or Korea, which also have a lot of cynicism and lack of confidence in institutions, they have very high suicide rates. Well, in the US, you have all these young people who have access to all these guns, and instead of maybe committing suicide, they just decide to go shoot up people, and then that's their way of committing suicide. I mean, I don't want to overstate that either, but I mean, what we're talking about a society that is very nihilistic. And
we also have enormously high rates of opioid abuse and death, and other forms of addiction and death, alcoholism, rise in suicides, all of it to me is connected with a failure of elites and a failure of elite institutions to serve people and help people, and a corresponding breakdown in faith that these institutions will help, because they haven't.
Yeah, there was another major poll done recently of leadership around the world and looking at trust in governments. And it found, this is actually ironically, it was a study that was funded by NATO. And it found that Western governments, or for the most part, with a few exceptions, all have less than 50% approval and confidence. And many, in the case of the US government and like the French government and the British government, it was like in the 20% or 30 percentile range. Whereas ironically, the governments that have the most confidence in the world are the Chinese and the Vietnamese governments, which says something very interesting about, socialism and this idea of authoritarianism, where like a NATO-sponsored poll found that people in China and Vietnam trust their government more and have more and feel that their voice is respected more in their governments than in like the so-called democratic West. But in general, I think that we have to understand that there's this massive crisis, an institutional crisis that's, like you said, it's a product of these decades of neoliberal policies, of a decline in living standards, of the fact that people don't have any influence in their political system. They don't believe the media. And it's led to this online culture that people, younger than me, like people like in their teenagers and like early 20s, they talk about black pill culture, which is just completely nihilistic. And it's very sad and depressing to see. And, in the US, it's people, I think under 40, it's the first generation ever where the life expectancy is lower than their parents. So we are really facing a major crisis, a systemic crisis in the United States. And of course, conservatives and especially, theocrats will say that this is all because of supposedly a lack of religion or whatever. No, I think the left has to push back and provide a more convincing explanation of, this is a major decline in the capitalist system. And, there are people trapped in debt. Their jobs suck. To the extent that there has been an increase in employment since the 2008 crash. A lot of that employment was precarious labor in horrible jobs like delivering food and like driving Ubers and stuff. So it makes sense that a lot of people have lost confidence in the system because their lives have gotten
lousy health care. They can't afford decent health care. They're on some $5,000 deductible plan or whatever. A million reasons why they're financially precarious in a dozen different ways. There are a lot of reasons to be struggling right now, and tens of millions of people are in this country, if not more. And there's a lot of reasons for lack of confidence, and it's about time the left offered a lot more concrete solutions to it, or any.
Yeah, so I just wanted to raise that important point because it's good to critique the media, but I think it's also important to have that larger contextual analysis to show that this lack of confidence in the media is a symptom of the overall problem.
No, you're absolutely right. I think that's a great point. And I guess we'll end on that. But again, I encourage people to read multipolarista.com. And the article is Polls Show Almost No One Trusts U.S. Media After Decades of War, Propaganda, and Lies. My guest has been Benjamin Norton, editor of Multipolarista. And as always, Ben, thanks for the great work. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure. Keep up the good work.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.